The cargo van came up my lane just past 2 on a Tuesday afternoon, its suspension bottoming out on the frost heaves where the gravel goes soft each spring. It was loaded to the headliner with furniture and moving blankets. A rolled mattress strapped to the roof with yellow ratchet straps, and a tower fan wedged sideways against the passenger window like an afterthought. The driver had his window down and his elbow out in 9-degree weather, taking in my property with the slow sweep of somebody doing a first-pass appraisal. I was standing at the end of my dock with a coffee going cold, 18 acres of mixed cedar and birch behind me. Georgian Bay out ahead, gray and flat that afternoon, a pair of mergansers working the far shallows. I'd been watching them for about 20 minutes before I heard the engine. The van stopped at the top of the lane and the driver got out and looked at my boathouse. He looked at it the way a man looks at something he's already decided belongs in his future. What he didn't know, what neither of them knew, was that I'd spent the past 4 weeks making sure this exact moment went exactly one way. My name is Morris Alcott. I'm 64 years old. For 32 years I was a civil engineer with the provincial government, mostly highway drainage and culvert design out of Owen Sound. It sounds unglamorous, and it was, which suited me fine. The work is about keeping water where it belongs and out of where it doesn't, and the consequences of getting it wrong show up in landslides and washouts, and the kind of road failures that make the evening news. You learn to be precise. You learn to document everything. You learn that the difference between a problem managed and a problem that manages you is almost always paperwork. I retired 4 years ago and bought the property 6 months after that. 18 acres on a private lane off the county road, about 40 minutes north of Owen Sound on the bay side of the Bruce Peninsula. The main structure was a 1978 timber frame cottage, which is a generous way of saying the insulation was pink bats held in. By hope, the plumbing ran through unheated crawl space, and 3 of the 4 windows on the north face had been replaced with plywood at some point and left that way. There was a boathouse in decent shape, a storage shed, and a dock that had been allowed to go soft at the far end. I paid $387,000 for it, every dollar from 32 years of provincial salary and a pension I'd never borrowed against. No inheritance, no windfalls. The closing was in December midweek at a title office in Owen Sound, where the notary called me sir about 9 times in 40 minutes and handed over the deed with both hands like it was a diploma. I drove out to the property afterward and sat in the dark in my truck at the end of the lane for a while, not looking at what it was, looking at what Agnes would have said about it. Agnes died 22 months before I bought the property. Ovarian cancer 14 months from the first scan to the last morning. We talked about retiring somewhere on the water for most of our marriage. She had a way of describing the life we'd have there. Morning coffee on a dock, loons in the evening, winters quiet enough that you'd actually hear the snowfall. She never made it, but she described it well enough that I knew exactly what I was looking for when I went looking. I spent the first 18 months gutting and rebuilding the cottage myself, with help from a pair of brothers named Pete and Cormac, who did finish carpentry out of Wyerton, and could read a timber frame the way other men read a newspaper. We re-insulated the whole envelope with spray foam and mineral wool. I replaced every window. I ran new plumbing through a proper interior chase. I wired the panel myself, which my son Derek still gives me grief about, although it passed inspection on the first submission. I rebuilt the dock with pressure-treated decking and new helical piles, fixed the far end that had gone punky, added a bench at the end that faces southwest for the evenings. By the time it was done, I'd put another $94,000 into it over 18 months. It wasn't a show cottage. It didn't have a wine fridge or a media room or quartz countertops. It had a wood stove that could heat the whole main floor on its own, a kitchen with a gas range I'd been promising myself since my 40s, and a sleeping loft with a window that looked north across the bay. On clear nights in October with the stove going and the loons calling, it was exactly the place Agnes had described. I'd been living there full-time for just under 2 years when Tamara Whitcomb called. She's my son Derek's wife. They've been married 6 years, live in a semi-detached in Hamilton. Derek is a millwright, good with his hands, steady. Tamara worked in pharmaceutical sales. She's organized and quick and has a way of starting difficult conversations with your name, spoken as a single word, a comma's worth of pause after it, which lets you know you're about to be managed. Morris, she said, then the pause, I need to bring something to you. I was at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and some seed catalogs. The bay was doing something spectacular with the late light. I put the catalog down. She told me her younger sister Greta and Greta's husband Boyd were going through a difficult stretch. Their lease in Guelph had ended, the landlord had sold the building and the new owner wasn't renewing tenancies, and they'd been staying with Tamara and Derek in Hamilton for 5 weeks. The house was a two-bedroom semi, 4 adults. It was cramped, it was getting tense. She said she'd been thinking about it, and the answer was obvious. I had 2 spare bedrooms. The property had space. Greta and Boyd were good people who'd take care of the place, and they could keep me company through the winter, which she noted, with real warmth in her voice, could get quite isolated up on the peninsula. I said, I don't recall being asked. She said, I'm asking now. I said, have you spoken with Derek about this? There was a particular quality to the pause that followed, the kind that tells you the answer before the words do. She said Derek understood that family pulls together. That wasn't a yes, it wasn't my son's voice. It was a principle, held up like authorization. I said I'd need to think about it. She said there wasn't much time, that Greta and Boyd were anxious to get settled. I said I understood, and I'd be in touch. She said fine, but they were hoping for an answer by the end of the week. That night I sat out on the dock until the temperature dropped enough to make it foolish. Then I went inside and got a yellow legal pad from the drawer beside the wood stove. I didn't call her back, I didn't call Derek, I made a list. The first call the next morning was to a property solicitor in Owen Sound, named Peter Osawe, who had been doing real estate and estate transfers on the peninsula for over 20 years, and spoke with the particular patience of someone who has watched families argue themselves into expensive positions for 2 decades. I laid it out without adjectives. He told me what I already suspected. The property was in my name alone, clear title, registered at the Land Registry Office in Owen Sound, and no living person had any legal standing to invite a third party onto it without my consent. If someone arrived and refused to leave after a clear request, that was trespass under the Provincial Act. He said, document the request in writing before any confrontation, not after. I asked what happens if they show up anyway. He said, then you call the OPP, it's not complicated, Morris. I thanked him and booked a follow-up. My home insurance broker was next. I've been with the same brokerage since I bought my first house in 1993, and have never filed a claim. He confirmed what I'd suspected. An unauthorized long-term occupant creates liability complications and can complicate a future claim. He said, and I appreciated this, you're one of the cleanest files on my book. That afternoon I drove into Owen Sound and bought 2 cellular trail cameras, the kind that push time-stamped photos directly to your phone. I'd used similar technology on project sites to log equipment deliveries. I set one inside the tree line at the top of my lane, angled to cover the approach. The second I mounted on the boathouse fascia covering the front of the cottage and the turnaround. Motion triggered, infrared, date and timestamp on every frame. I walked the coverage area twice until there was no gap. On Thursday, I retained a family and property lawyer in Owen Sound named Celestine Adeyemi, who had the deliberate manner of someone who had been surprised by family dynamics exactly never. She listened to everything. She asked if I had documentation of Tamara's request. I had the original call, which I hadn't recorded, but I had 3 text messages. Tamara following up, referencing the arrangement, one mentioning they'd planned to arrive before the long weekend. Celestine said save all of it. She drafted a formal notice for my signature. No person other than myself had authorization to occupy or inhabit the property, and any arrival without written consent would be treated accordingly. She sent it by registered mail on the Friday, $2,000 for the retainer. She said, you're not being unreasonable, you're being prepared. That Sunday, Derek called. He's 37. He's been a millwright with the same heavy manufacturing plant since his apprenticeship IMA local. He has his mother's way of going quiet when he's working something out. He had a quality in his voice that afternoon I hadn't heard from him before. A careful flatness, like he was reading from notes. He said Tamara had been pretty stressed. He said Greta and Boyd had had a rough go. He said the property was bigger than I needed for one person, and he figured a few months wouldn't. I said, Derek, did you agree to this before Tamara called me? Silence, 3 seconds, 4. He said she'd mentioned it. He'd said he'd think about it. I said, so you didn't agree? He was quiet. I said, son, nobody moves someone into my home without asking me. Asking means waiting for the answer. He said he knew that. He asked if I'd talk to Tamara again, maybe work something out. I said I'd talk to him, face to face. I told him to come up the following weekend. He came up alone on a Saturday. When he got out of his truck, he was carrying something in his posture that I recognized. The weight of a man who's been pulled in 2 directions long enough that he's started to forget which way he was originally facing. We walked the property. I showed him the new dock, the section of brush I'd cleared along the south fence, the kitchen garden along the east wall that had produced more zucchini than any 2 people could reasonably eat. We split a cord of red oak in the afternoon without talking much. which is the best conversation I have ever had with my son. Afterward, we sat on the dock with ginger ales, and he asked why I was digging in over a few months. I said, because the pattern concerns me more than the request. He asked what I meant. I said 5 weeks ago Greta and Boyd moved into your house for what was supposed to be a short stay. Close? He said, more or less. I said, now they're being moved to my property because the first arrangement stopped working for the person who made it. Derek, I'm not a holding facility, and I need you to think about what happens when 3 months becomes 6, and 6 becomes a mailing address. And a mailing address becomes a legal question about who's been residing on this property, and for how long. He didn't answer immediately. I said there were some things I wanted to find out before I said more, and whatever I found I would tell him straight. That was my only promise. He drove home Sunday. I watched his taillights at the end of the lane and stood there until the pines swallowed the dark. Then I called a licensed private investigator in Barrie named Gareth Moss. The name had come from Celestine, and asked for a background and financial picture on 2 names, Greta and Boyd Nairn. $700. He said he'd have something within the week. I want to be honest with you, because I've been honest about everything else. That phone call was the part that cost me the most. Not the lawyer, not the cameras, not standing in my own lane and saying no to somebody. That call. The moment I placed it, I stopped being a man protecting his property and became a man investigating his son's family. I sat at the kitchen table afterward with my hand still on the phone, and I thought about Agnes and whether she'd have done the same thing, and I genuinely didn't know. I did it anyway. The report came Thursday. I read it at the kitchen table with the wood stove going and the bay dark outside. Boyd Nairn had a civil judgment against him from 2021. Just over $19,000 from a contractor dispute out of a renovation company he'd run for 4 years before it folded. A second judgment, smaller, from a former landlord in Mississauga. 2 vehicles with outstanding balances. Credit score in the low 500s. Greta had a provincial tax lien and a debt on a credit account that had been sent to collections 18 months prior. The Guelph tenancy that had ended when the landlord sold had in fact ended 3 months before that, according to an LTB filing, non-payment of rent, 2 months outstanding. There was one more thing. Over the previous 9 months, transfers totaling approximately $43,000 had moved from a checking account in Derek and Tamara's joint names into an account registered to Greta Nairn. The memo line on most of them read, loan. I put the file down. I got up and looked out the window at the bay, which was doing nothing in particular, which felt appropriate. $43,000. Derek had called me 8 months ago to tell me they were getting close to saving enough for a down payment. He'd mentioned a neighborhood in the east end of Hamilton. Good transit, he'd said. Close to the plant. Tamara had picked it out. He'd said they were maybe 14 months away. I called Gareth back and asked what else he could find. He said he could go deeper for an additional $500. I said do it. The second report arrived the following Monday, and I read it standing at the counter. Tamara had left her pharmaceutical sales position 11 months earlier. She had not told Derek. She had continued to maintain all the appearances of employment, leaving in the morning, returning in the evening, a routine indistinguishable from before. Their joint savings were being drawn down at a rate that would exhaust them within 4 months. She had applied for a home equity loan using Derek's income documentation. They rented and had no equity, so it was denied, but the inquiry was there, dated, on the record, and she had paid for a consultation with a paralegal service in Guelph, Ontario. The billing descriptor described the subject as the rights of a long-term occupant, who has contributed financially to a property they do not hold title to, and the conditions under which such a claim might be pursued. I read that paragraph twice, then a third time standing at my kitchen counter with the bay behind me, and the stove ticking and everything very quiet. Celestine told me later that such a claim in Ontario, against clear registered title with no written agreement of any kind, would almost certainly have failed. But it wouldn't have needed to succeed. It would have needed only to cost me 2 years, $30,000 in legal fees, and whatever remained of my peace of mind. And someone had been willing to sit across a table and discuss the theory with her. I closed the folder. I looked out at the property, the dock, the boathouse, the section of cedar I'd cleared by hand over the first winter. What came wasn't anger. I'd expected anger. What came instead was the same particular calm I used to feel at the end of a full drainage assessment, when all the measurements were on the page, and you understood exactly what had to happen next. Celestine sent the formal notice by registered mail that week. A copy went to the paralegal service on record. The letter stated clearly that no occupancy of the property had been authorized and that any claim of a financial interest in the property would be contested. She said, "Derek needs to know. He's better off hearing it from you." 3 days later, a Tuesday, the camera pushed a notification to my phone. Motion at the top of the lane, which is where we came in. The cargo van took the frost heaves wrong. It stopped at the top of the turnaround and the driver, Boyd, got out without looking at me first. He looked at the boathouse. He looked at the cottage. He looked at the storage shed along the south tree line. Greta came around from the passenger side with her arms already crossed and her expression set in a particular way, like someone who has already decided to be inconvenienced. I set my coffee on the dock post and walked up to the turnaround. I said, "Greta, Boyd, I wasn't expecting you." Boyd put his hands out, palms up. He said Tamara had told them it was sorted. He said they'd driven up from Hamilton. He said he'd noticed the soffit on the boathouse needed a bit of attention. I said the boathouse was fine. He said, "Look, Morris, we know it's your place. We're not trying to step on anybody's toes. We just need a spot to land while we get ourselves sorted." Tamara said. I said, "Tamara doesn't make decisions about my property." The wind came off the bay. It was cold for September. Greta said, "We're family." I said the sentence I had written on my legal pad 4 weeks earlier, and practiced out loud in my truck twice, because I have no shame about being prepared. I said, "You're my son's wife's family. That's a different thing. I've had dinner with you 3 times in 6 years. I appreciate the drive, and I'm telling you clearly, I didn't agree to this, and you're not staying here." Boyd's face changed. The reasonable manner didn't slide off. It dropped. He said I was going to turn away family over a piece of paper. I said it wasn't a piece of paper. It was my home. I built it. He said, "Tamara said you could be difficult about things." Something went very still in my chest. I said, "I'm going to ask you once politely to get back in your van. There's a motel in Wyerton, about 25 minutes south. I'll write you the number if you want it." Greta said this was unbelievable. Boyd said they weren't leaving. They'd driven 3 hours. They had a right to at least come inside and talk. I said, "You don't have a right to be on this property. I own it. You weren't invited. If you'd like to keep discussing it, you can speak with my lawyer. Her name and number are on the registered letter I sent Tamara 9 days ago." That was when it changed. I watched Boyd look at Greta. I watched Greta look at Boyd. Up until that moment, this had been a story about a stubborn older man they could wear down over a long weekend. It had just become a story with a registered letter in it, a retainer number, a date stamp, and someone on the other end of a phone whose job is to make things complicated for people who proceed without authorization. Boyd walked to the tree line with his phone. I went back to the dock. I didn't stare him down. I stood on the dock I had rebuilt myself and drank my cold coffee and waited. 7 minutes by the camera timestamp. He came back, said something short to Greta. She grabbed her bag from the van with real energy. They got in. Boyd reversed down the lane, slowly, deliberately, like a man making a point, and they were gone. I want to tell you I felt something clean and righteous. I didn't. I went inside and checked that both cameras had full files, saved the clips to my email with the timestamp log, and called Celestine. Then I sat down at the kitchen table, and noticed my hands were unsteady enough that I spilled a bit of tea on the legal pad. That's the part that never makes it into these stories. You can be completely in the right, completely prepared, and standing in your own lane saying no to family still costs you something. It costs something every time. That night Tamara called. I let it go to voicemail. 8 minutes and 40 seconds of my character, my parenting, my probable inability to manage alone as I got older, and the assertion that she had documentation. Her word that I owed money to their household and intended to pursue it. She said Derek would hear about how I'd treated his family. She said I'd regret it. I transcribed the voicemail onto the legal pad by hand, dated it, and put it in the folder with the registered mail confirmation, the camera files, the solicitor's letter, and both of Gareth's reports. Then I called Derek and asked him to come up. He arrived Wednesday evening, later than he meant to. He looked thinner than the last time. He had that careful quality in his voice again. He started with, "Dad, Tamara's furious about the letter. She says you're trying to start a legal fight." I said, "Before you tell me what Tamara says, I need you to look at something, and I need you to look at it before her voice gets in your head. 10 minutes. Can you do that?" He looked at me for a long moment, then he said yes. I made tea and put the folder on the kitchen table under the light I'd wired myself, and I walked him through it the way I'd have walked a junior engineer through a site assessment. No drama, no adjectives, the judgments against Boyd, the dates, the amounts, the LTB filing, the credit picture, the timeline of the Guelph tenancy ending 2 months before they'd said, the $43,000. I watched his face when he got to the transfer total. He went completely still. Not upset still. The kind of still a man goes when the floor makes a sound it shouldn't make. He went back a page. He read it again. Then I put the page about the paralegal consultation in front of him. The billing description. The subject. A long-term occupant and their potential financial claim to a property held by a family member. He read it twice slowly, his finger under the line. He set the paper down. He looked out the black window at the bay. He said, "She told me those transfers to Greta were short-term loans. That they'd pay it back in the spring when Boyd's new thing got off the ground." I said, "I know." He said, "She told me she was having a difficult quarter at work. I thought she meant commissions were down." I said, "I know." He put his hand over his mouth and sat that way for 2 minutes. Outside, the bay was doing what it does in September. Wind coming in from the northwest, small waves against the dock. He said, "How long has she not been working?" I said, 11 months documented, possibly longer. He said, "Dad, that was our down payment. I've been putting in extra Saturdays since January. I took on a shutdown contract in March. I thought we were getting close." His voice went on the last word. "I thought we were almost there." I said, "I know, son." He got up and opened the back door and stood in the frame looking at the dark water. I let him. I made more tea. That's all I had for him in that moment. When he came back, he sat down and said, "Why would she do this?" I thought about it before I answered, because I wanted to be fair even then. I said, "I think Greta has needed rescuing for most of Tamara's adult life, and somewhere along the way Tamara decided that being the one who fixes things was the only version of herself she knew how to trust." At their wedding reception 5 years ago, Tamara had a bit too much wine and told me about growing up in a rental outside Brantford, her father gone, her mother working 2 jobs, and being the one who made sure Greta got to school, got through high school, got out. She was proud of it, rightly so. But somewhere in there the habit of sacrifice became the whole identity, and the people around her became problems she was obligated to solve, whether they wanted it or not. I said, "That's not an excuse. She deceived her husband. She moved money out of their shared future. She consulted someone about how to establish a claim against my land. Understanding where a wound comes from doesn't mean you hand someone a knife and stand still. But if you've ever loved someone who confuses rescue with love, you already know the trap. And you know it doesn't end until someone refuses to be the next thing they spend." Derek stayed 4 days. We didn't talk about lawyers. We restained the deck on the north side of the cottage, which had been on the list since spring. I made a lamb stew that came out well and a loaf of sourdough that came out like a doorstop, and he ate 2 slices of it without being asked to be kind about it. On his last night, we sat on the dock and watched the stars come in over the bay, and neither of us said anything for a long while. Then he said, "I've been afraid to look at it clearly, because looking at it means I have to decide something." I said, "I know. That's what she was counting on. It isn't weakness, Derek. It's what loyalty looks like from the inside when someone's using it against you." He drove home Friday morning in the fog. I watched his taillights disappear at the bend in the lane. The months that followed were harder than anything I could have protected him from, and I won't pretend otherwise. He confronted her. She admitted the job, dismissed it as a career transition she hadn't been ready to discuss. She disputed the transfer amounts, said Garrett's report was inaccurate, said the paralegal consultation was exploratory, and had gone nowhere, said I had always tried to come between them. He listened to all of it. Then he'd call me in the evenings and we'd go through it slowly, separating what was on the page from what someone claimed was on the page. A counselor he started seeing told him privately, around 6 weeks in, that the pattern he was describing had a name, and that it wasn't his fault. He called me that same evening to tell me. I could hear something different in his voice, a lightness that had been missing for a long time. Fragile at first, the way light looks through ice. She moved out in February. Her lawyer sent Celestine a letter raising the question of my property and a possible financial interest. Celestine replied with the registered mail record, the dated title history, the clean chain of ownership, and 4 paragraphs on Ontario real property law. The other lawyer didn't respond. 10 days later, he withdrew from the matter entirely. The divorce was finalized the following October. Derek called me from the parking lot outside the courthouse in Hamilton, his voice flat and clear, the kind of flat that comes after something long and exhausting finally stops. He said it was done. I asked how he felt. He said mostly relief and some anger at himself for how long it took. I said don't carry that part too far. He moved to Owen Sound in the spring, transferred his ticket to the IML local there, took a position at a facility near Meaford, rented a place 10 minutes from the highway that runs down to my lane. He started coming out on weekends, not always to help, mostly just to sit. In the fall he started seeing a woman named Rory, who teaches secondary school in Owen Sound, and grew up on a beef operation outside Chatsworth and has extremely specific opinions about firewood species. The first time she came up to the property she walked the whole wood line before she'd come inside, looking at my stacked cord, running her finger along the split ends the way someone does who grew up doing it. She said I'd done a decent job on the dock for a roads engineer. I said I'd spent 32 years watching other people do things wrong and it had left a mark. She said it showed. I liked her before we'd made it to the porch steps. And Derek stood there, watching the two of us talk with the look of a man who's been in a cold house for a long time, and has just walked into one that has a fire going. Last April, the two of them came up on a Sunday afternoon with no particular reason given. Rory was carrying something inside her coat with both hands, the way you carry something new and fragile. It was a small cotton hat, the kind for an infant, cream-colored, smaller than my open hand. Derek said they wanted me to know first. I couldn't find anything to say for a good while. I sat there thinking about the years it took to make this place into something worth being in, and the years ahead of teaching somebody small what Georgian Bay sounds like in November when the wind comes off the open water, and the ice hasn't formed yet, and the geese are still moving south overhead. I bought this property for quiet, for solitude, for the version of a life that Agnes and I had described to each other for 30 years. What I ended up with is harder to name and worth considerably more. Here's what this taught me, and it isn't what I expected. For 32 years I thought documentation was about protecting yourself from blame. It isn't. Documentation is how you stay calm. Everything I did in those 4 weeks, the letter, the cameras, the lawyer, the investigator, none of it was revenge. It was about making sure that when the moment came I wouldn't have to argue. Because you cannot win an argument with someone who has decided that your reality is negotiable. You can only decline to participate in it. The mistake most people make is thinking that being right is enough. Being right without being prepared just makes you someone who gets overrun and explains afterward why they shouldn't have been. So here's the one thing I'd ask you to do today before this leaves your head. Go find the documents on the thing that matters most to you, the deed, the title, the lease, the beneficiary designation on the account. Read it, know whose name is on it, know who has a key. 10 minutes. Not because you're expecting a van in your lane, but because the day you need to know is never the day you have time to find out. And here's the question I'm still sitting with. Who in your life has already decided that your no is just the opening position? You'll know them by the way they announce things to you instead of asking. By the way your opinion arrives as a formality, after the decision has already been made. If you think I was right to stand in my lane and say no, leave a comment 1. If you think I should have let them stay a few months and kept the peace, leave a comment 2. And if you think I went too far the day I hired an investigator to look into my daughter-in-law, some nights I still wonder, leave a comment 3. There's no wrong answer. I'm genuinely not certain about my own. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I read everyone. It still gets me, knowing somebody's hearing this on their morning commute somewhere far from here. The kind of distance that makes the world feel smaller, and the problems in it a little less specific to you alone. And if you've ever had someone move into your life without being invited, a relative, an in-law, someone who mistook your kindness for an open door, tell me what you did. Someone watching tonight needs to know they're not the only one. If this story meant something to you, subscribe and stay a while. It's just stories like this one. Ordinary people, quiet decisions. The moment someone finally stops apologizing for holding on to what's theirs. This is a fictional story inspired by real emotional experiences, created for original content. Any resemblance to actual persons or events is coincidental.